You're listening to BQN. Assimilate the audio.
Good morning, I'm Chrissie De Clerck-Szilagyi.
And I'm Jason Szilagyis with today's Caffeinated History with the Szilagyis on the BQN Podcast Collective.
Before we jump into our topic for the day, we'd like to take a moment to thank our BQN Patreon patrons who make our show possible. Listeners, you can hear your name listed as one of our associate producers for a monthly subscription of just $10 at patreon.com/BQN. And with a monthly subscription of $5 or more, you can join our meetings of the Hive Mind. Watch your Patreon messages for details. Today's topic is the Vestal Virgins. Of all of Rome's religious organizations, the Vestal Virgins might be the most recognizable to a modern audience, though they are not well understood. The Vestal Virgins were priestesses of the goddess Vesta, who ruled over the hearth, home, and family. Worship of Vesta dates to pre-Roman tribes who lived in Latium and around the Tiber River. The Romans believe she is the daughter of the god Saturn, patron of time, creation, wealth, and many other things, and the goddess Ops, Saturn's sister and the patroness of earth and fertility. And as with many of the Roman pantheon, she became associated with a Greek goddess as well, Hestia. Vesta's temple was in the Forum, near the Regia, the home and office of the Pontifex Maximus, and many other temples. The building was circular, possibly to reflect the shape of the traditional huts common to the area in prehistory. The legendary king Numa Pompilus is credited with the building of this temple to house the priesthood he created. Unlike most temples dedicated to a specific god, Vesta's focus point was not a statue of the goddess, but a hearth fire burning brightly. This was the hearth fire of the Roman people, and it was the Vestal's sacred duty to never let it die out. At any given time, there were at least 18 Vestals, 6 novitiates, 6 actively conducting the duties, and 6 who taught the novices. It was a great honor for a family to have a daughter chosen to join the Vestals. Candidates were reviewed by the Pontifex Maximus. They had to be freeborn, have both parents still alive, and be free of any moral or physical defects. They were chosen before puberty, between the ages of 6 and 10. In the early years of Rome, they were exclusively chosen from patrician families, but it was open to all Roman citizens later in the Republic. On entering this priesthood, the girl made a vow of virginity and chastity for the next 30 years, the usual term of service, though it was not uncommon for Vestals to stay with the temple after their term had ended. In exchange for giving up this large part of her life, a Vestal was granted rights held by no other Roman women. She was exempt from male guardianship, meaning she could conduct business and own and bequeath property in her own name. Vestals were also some of the few people in Rome whose persons were considered sacrosanct and inviolate. Anyone who harmed a Vestal was metaphorically attacking the state, and so could be immediately executed. On a less serious note, they had reserved seating at the games and at shows, and they were the only Romans allowed to travel in enclosed horse-drawn carriages within the city. They were also accompanied by lictors, personal guards, who protected them and enforced their right-of-way in public spaces. Lastly, they were some of the few types of people allowed to be buried within the sacred boundaries of the city, as their bodies were part of the state. While keeping the sacred hearth was the most important of the Vestal's duties, it was not the only one. They produced the sacred salted flour used to consecrate sacrificial animals across the Roman cults, maintained the temple with both ritual and literal cleaning, collected water from sacred springs to be used in rituals, and guarded the sacred storerooms which held artifacts important to Rome's history and the wills of Roman citizens. They also oversaw the Vestalia, the Feast of Vesta, which happened annually from the 7th to the 15th of June, and contributed to and participated in many other festivals year-round. When their term of service ended, they were permitted to leave the house of the Vestals and live on their own. They were provided a pension from the state and still maintained control over their money and property. Despite their previous vow of virginity, once a Vestal left, she was free to marry if she chose. Even so, many chose to stay with the temple, as it was the only life they had known for decades. Vestals who were found to be delinquent in their duties were punished according to the severity of the crime. The two things that would have the most effect on the state were to allow the fire to go out or to break her vow of chastity. Vesta's fire represented the hearth fires of all of Rome, and its loss was considered a terrible omen. A Vestal who allowed the fire to go out was whipped to satisfy any anger from the gods, and then the fire was relit with special materials and strictly followed rituals. If the fire went out spontaneously, through no fault of its priestesses, the Pontifex Maximus and other priests investigated by reading auspices and conducting sacrifices to determine what portents or warnings the gods might be trying to convey. Once this was settled, the fire would be relit. In this case, the Vestal was not held to blame. A Vestal who broke her vow of virginity had metaphorically allowed an attack on Rome itself. The penetration of a Vestal was as bad as an enemy penetrating the city's walls. The man involved would be publicly beaten to death by the Pontifex Maximus, and the Vestal was buried alive. An underground chamber was prepared near the city walls with a table, chair, lamp, and a small amount of food and water. The woman was taken in a closed cart to the site, where she had to willingly descend the ladder, creating a fiction that the state had not executed her. Even a Vestal virgin who had broken her vows remained sacrosanct. There are no records of a Vestal refusing her punishment, but this does not mean they were never falsely accused. Vestals could be used as scapegoats, their supposed negligence blamed for a drought or a loss of a battle. Elements of the worship of Vesta survived the Christianization of Rome. Nuns take similar vows of chastity as her priestesses, and the Virgin Mary took her place as the patroness of family and home. The Temple of Vesta was one of the last to be dismantled after Christianity became the official religion of Rome. Vesta's flame was not extinguished until 391. Thank you for listening. We'd also like to thank our History with the Szilagyis Patreon patrons, Pati, Susan Capuzzi-De Clerck, Laura, Kris Hill, Betty Larson, and Vince Locke. Their contributions help us to have the time to research and write what you're hearing. You can help us just like they do with a monthly subscription at patreon.com/historywiththeszilagyis. Also, thank you to Mark White for the awesome show art and Zach Tripp for the wonderful closing music. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast player, and don't forget to rate and review us there as well. And while you're at it, check out the rest of the great shows on the BQN Collective. We'd love to hear what you think. If you'd like to reach out, you can find our network on Twitter and Blue Sky at BQN Podcasts, and this podcast in particular at History Szilagyi. You can also talk about any and all of the BQN podcasts in our Facebook group, the BQN Collective. And last but not least, you can find me on Twitter and Blue Sky at The Goddess Livia. That's TheGoddessLivia.
And me at Jason Dark Elf. We'd love to hear topic suggestions. What would you like to learn on Caffeinated History?